panel presentation and discussion on suicidal behavior, creating a caring and compassionate circle of care through campus community collaborations. This webinar is hosted by the Campus Mental Health Community of Practice, and it will include panelists Mark Senior, Ed Mantler, and Eric Wimber. The session will also be moderated by myself, Lena DiGenova, and of course, Dr. Tayyab Rashid from the University of Toronto at Scarborough, and I'm from McGill University. Today, before we begin, we want to acknowledge that the discussion today about suicidal behavior is sensitive, emotionally charged, and may be a trigger to you. This is a normal response, and we encourage you to take care of yourself. If you need a short break, please take one. And if you need to reach out for support, please do so. On this slide, we included some contact information from Crisis Services Canada with a national number, as well as province and territory supports that you will find on the website. Now, today we will begin by providing you with a brief overview of the context of suicidal behavior in post-secondary institutions across Canada. We wanted to create a space for our community of practice to talk about suicidal behavior during the pandemic, as we know that it is a very difficult time for students, and of course there are many concerns about student mental health. And we are honored to have three distinguished panelists with diverse perspectives that we will introduce in a few moments. We will introduce you properly. And they're joining us today for a discussion about not only their work, but also how post-secondary institutions can create compassionate circles of care. As per caucus tradition, we want to have some time for your questions. And to honor our panelists and other participants' time, we invite you to your questions at the Q&A portion of the webinar, which will be a little bit later in the session today. And we request that you engage in the chat feature at that time, as Khadija mentioned earlier. You're welcome to send the moderators, myself or Tayyab, questions privately. Now, I will turn it over to my colleague Tayyab to take it away.
Thank you, Lena, and thank you everyone for joining us on this very important topic. I couldn't be more grateful to all of you, to my colleague, a wonderful colleague, Lena, Caucus. I'm very thankful to Caucus Secretariat for putting this together, and to our three absolutely wonderful panelists, whom we will, if you hold your breath, we will introduce them in a bit. Let me also start with the background. Khatija, I'm not able to see the slides just in case. Yes. Okay, so that's if hopefully everyone can see. This is the title, and if we can move to the next one. Next slide, please. So while the slides are moving, we can practice our breath and some mid-afternoon meditation. These are meditative moments. But I know what the context that I wanted to give, and one that is near and dear to my heart. I had the wonderful pleasure of presenting with Dr. Mark Senior a couple of years ago, because this is a project that we started a couple of years ago while Dr. Senior was our staff psychiatrist at University of Toronto Scarborough campus. Over the years in dealing with clients, I'm a clinical psychologist and Dr. Senior is a psychiatrist. And over the years, what we saw, there's lots of challenges that post-secondary institutes face. The number one challenge that our institutions are facing, the fine balance between privacy, safety, and confidentiality. So privacy is every person have the right, have their information should be collected, stored, or disclosed. Confidentiality in a more ethical and legal context goes way beyond, and where there is a duty to inform. But the things become a little bit more challenging when there's a crisis on campus that whom the information should be disclosed, how much this should be disclosed, and how to balance the family's wishes for privacy. Plus, now we have another, in last 10 years, that we have seen a cultural shift. There is the social media. And you have seen on your campuses not only about suicidal behavior, but many other things that creates whole new set of challenges, which also brings some legal perspectives. So this webinar is not about those aspects which we're going to talk about, just to set the context that how we can create a caring and compassionate circle, because campus is not an island, folks. Campus is a part of the community, and how we can create these bridges between campuses and community. That's why we have folks from our community as well. The other thing which also we have to be very mindful, having worked at a university counseling center for over a decade, and previously I worked in 5 different counseling centers in the United States. There's always tussle because the families want to know lots of information about what's going on. In number of cases that I've dealt firsthand, whenever possible, and when there is a consent, clear consent, clear understanding from the student, involving the family or the people they trust, can be very helpful. But again, there's no clear-cut line. So that's another challenge, which from clinician to student services to higher administration, we all face. The other important thing is suicidal behavior is just an indicator of something that might be happening precedingly. There are lots of factors that predict somewhat reliably that the student or young adult is going to engage in that kind of behavior. And do we have good scientific evidence-based understanding of those factors? And how can we cooperate, learn from communities? Especially, it's my challenge oftentimes that I find is not only the handling of the crisis, but it's the after the crisis. How we create a compassionate, caring community on campus, as well as involve community partners who can support our students. And more importantly, we live in a very culturally diverse society, and culture is at the forefront in everything that we do. Some of you might have heard this expression of idiom of distress. Idiom of distress varies from culture to culture. Even this young adults that we are seeing in at post-secondary campuses who are born and raised in Canada, they still come from families with varying degrees of cultural acculturation, shall I say. So acculturative stress is also an important factor, and there is, especially given the context of last couple of weeks which we have been seeing, it is especially important that we need our understanding of suicidal behavior or parasuicidal behavior needs to be contextualized in the culture, in the both wider culture, but also the familial culture. And let's not make some assumptions that the familial culture of one family from a same culture would be uniformly same. There are variations. So we need to take very nuanced, mindful, evidence-based approach, because those are the challenges that we face. I hope, Dr. Dijanova, these are some of those summary, because our audience don't want to hear, they may want to hear us, but they want to hear from our panelists. So over to you.
Absolutely. So while we're sorting out some of the technical components, I did want to share a little bit of my campus experience at McGill. So as the Director of Strategy and Evaluation at McGill, I have been working with a broad group, an advisory group of stakeholders that includes students, faculty, and staff. And we have the fortune of working as well with the guidance of the Mental Health Commission of Canada and Suicide Action Montreal on the development of a student suicide prevention and postvention framework. And what we heard early on in those campus conversations was that we needed a space for dialogue. We needed a space for healing. And all of those elements that Tayab mentioned, those elements around confidentiality and respecting families' wishes, but also working to create circles of care became really, really important in the campus dialogue. And what was interesting is that the early conversation was predominantly around prevention, early warning signs. And then over time, it was the student leaders who spoke up and said, we absolutely need to have a space for community, a space for dialogue. We really need to have spaces for healing. And so I'm not sure if the slides are back on, but we will share the slides with everyone. And we have two models that I wanted to talk really briefly about today, because we do want to get to our panelists. One model is from the Suicide Prevention and Resource Center out of the US. And what we learned from that particular model is that it takes a really a comprehensive approach to suicide prevention. So we see not only those early warning signs and those sort of elements, but also elements that look at postvention, that look at life skill development and connectedness. And there's a second model that we'll share with you when we have the slides. That's out of the Ontario Youth and Health Center, I believe, a mental health center. And that model is really great. Yes, thank you, Khadija. This is wonderful. So we're on slide, I think, 8 by now. So no problem. It's all good. It's all technology. In this model, what's interesting is that the second model not only looks at risk prevention and postvention, because postvention, the actions that a community takes following a suicide is extremely important. And because it's important to create spaces for healing, an important component for prevention and part of prevention. And what we see in this Ontario youth model is a model that also embraces prevention methods, which is the traditional ones around early identification, kind of early alert and early warning signs, but also life promotion. And what I really appreciate about the model is that it encourages and takes as an assumption that young people have the capacity to create solutions and the capacity to embrace life and create a meaningful life for themselves. And at the heart of the model is a community collaboration and community mobilization, one in which youth co-create the model with them. And that's really the spirit of the model that we've been using at McGill University to create this prevention and postvention framework. And it's also something that I've been hearing about as a trend in what we're learning about from other campuses and the kinds of conversations that we're having there. So those are, we just wanted to set a little bit of the context, and those are some models and some perspectives we wanted to share as we move into conversations about enhancing circles of care for students. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Mark Senior. And Khadija, I'm not sure if we're able to move the slides along, because Dr. Senior has some really fantastic slides with some really important I thought they were pretty nice. I've seen them. I think they look great. But it would be great to be able to view them. So if we can get those going, that'll be wonderful. But Dr. Mark Senior is an associate professor at the University of Toronto, and also a psychiatrist at Sunnybrook Health Services Center, and a member of the International COVID-19 Suicide Prevention Research Collaboration. So I'm going to turn it over to you to share your work, Dr. Senior, and thank you for joining us today.
Khatija, if you're not able to move the slide, I can share the presentation from my computer just to make sure that we honor our presenters with their slides.
Okay, so maybe I'll launch it, and then if Tayab, if you can get it going, great. Thank you to Lena and to Tayab and all of my fellow panelists, and for the organizers. I really appreciate having the opportunity to be here. And actually, I'm fine with the idea of the slides malfunctioning, because a lot of my focus is really in messaging resilience, even when you have adversity. So I don't mind if there's a bit of adversity as part of the presentation. Although, of course, Tayab being a good, part of the thing that helps with adversity is having a good friend. And because Tayab is a good friend, he's going to help me with that. So, so if you just go one more slide ahead now. So what I mainly wanted to talk today a little bit about is messaging. So you can see here, this was an article that came out a few months ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, which was talking about different factors that play into suicide. And there are 14 broad groups. But down at the bottom here, you see effects of the media, which is actually just one format of messaging. There are other ways that we message across society. But I think it's an untapped area often in the university space. And I'll just share with you a very quick anecdote. You know, there were two studies that recently came out of U of T. One of them was by my colleague, Roger McIntyre, who did modeling, statistical modeling, and suggested that the pandemic was going to cause a huge uptick in suicides in Toronto. And then we published a study looking at actual Google Trends data, which sometimes can map nicely onto actual suicide rates, not always, but sometimes. And worldwide and in the US in the first month of the pandemic, rates of searches for suicide and how to kill yourself went down quite precipitously. And there was an increase in searches of how to survive and how to be together. Interestingly, the other article made it to the front page of the Globe or the Toronto Star, the top headline, and nobody covered my article, even though it was actual data. I'm not worried about the coverage, but I think what I really want to communicate to you is that we're really preferentially sharing doom and gloom stories. And actually, a lot of the story of suicide prevention is not doom and gloom, because the overwhelming majority of people who think about suicide, pretty much all of my patients and everybody out there in the community, the vast majority never die by suicide. And that's something that people, I think, don't realize. And people think suicide rates are going up, even though in the Western world, actually, with the exception of the US, they've been going down over the past 20 years. So if we just go one more slide, Tab. So I always like to start with this quote: an idea is like a virus. It's resilient, highly contagious, and an idea can grow. And the smallest seed of an idea can grow to define or destroy your world. A simple little thought that changes everything. And if you click once more, you see the movie that this comes from, which is called Inception, which you guys might remember because of the very big explosions and sci-fi, if you've seen it. But in fact, at the heart of the film is a story of a man who is tortured because he's stuck in a dream with his wife, and the only way to get out of it is for them to kill themselves. And he plants this idea in his wife's mind that she should end her life. But unfortunately, after she escapes from the dream, the idea gets stuck, and she ends up ending her life afterwards. And this haunts the main character for the rest of his life. And so actually, I spend probably 60 or 75% of my research time thinking about Inception and thinking about the kind of ideas that we plant in the minds of people in our society, which really have quite a dramatic impact. Next slide, please. And so the idea of suicide contagion comes from this book called The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, the famous German author. This came out about 250 years ago. And it's a book in which the young man has unrequited love. Has a love interest. The woman he's interested in he is interested in is not interested in him. And in despair, at the end of the book, he ends his life. And after it was published in Germany and across Europe, there were a spate of stories of young men who were rejected romantically, dressing like Werther and ending their lives using the same method. And so that's the term for suicide contagion is called the Werther effect. And it's probably one of the most powerful effects in medicine, certainly in suicide. Next slide, please. This is a slide looking at suicides in the United States following the death of Robin Williams. And if you click a few points further, there you go, that's it. You can see that there were a predicted 16,849 suicides, which is just astronomical, but that's how many you get in such a big country as the US. In that 5-month period in 2014, and instead they saw almost 19,000 deaths. That was an excess of 1,800 plus people and a 10% increase. And there's almost nothing that you can find in the world other than actually like a plague, like the coronavirus, that can cause a top 10 cause of death to go up like this. And in fact, we've studied it. My colleague, Rob Whitley at McGill has found a similar increase, actually a larger magnitude increase in Canada. And we did a study recently in Australia, which showed that there was a similar increase. So all around the world, there was this huge spike in suicides after the story of death of Robin Williams. Next slide, please. And so in fact, we were very worried when, many of you are familiar with the show 13 Reasons Why. which came out in 2017, and we were all worried because it sends all the wrong messages. Everybody has a suicidal phase, everybody's in distress, common life events like bullying and relationship difficulties and so on are likely to be the only justification for suicide in the absence of a mental health problem. And it's destined and it achieves results because Hannah Baker, the main character, punished all of the people around her. So it was just sort of like a horrific set of all of the worst myths about suicide. And unfortunately, this was an article I put out in the Star in November of 2017 saying that Netflix has a morality problem and has to take off the show. They didn't. Next slide. And unfortunately, we ended up studying it. Last year, we published this article showing that there was a 13% increase in suicides in young people in the US after the show came out, in particular in young women. And there was no increase in adults, it was only in youth. And we showed a similar increase recently in a separate study in Ontario. And I mean, I have to tell you, I hate these graphs. I'm a scientist, I like to show graphs, but I sort of don't like them because I'm also a clinician. I've seen patients. I've had the horrific experience of patient suicide or counseling parents who have lost children to suicide. And if you've been involved even in a single case like this, it's such a tremendous tragedy that the idea that you could have, let's say, 100 more cases than expected in the US after a show comes out is just it's a mind-boggling kind of situation. Next slide, please. Last really kind of scary slide. This looks really friendly, but I find it's like the scariest slide in youth psychiatry. It's from my colleague Ian Coleman at the University of Ottawa. And what he essentially did was he looked at survey data of young people who were asked, how many of you know somebody who died by suicide in your school system? Know of somebody, not necessarily know them, but do you know of anybody in your school system? Have you heard reports of people dying by suicide and so on? And so the teal is the group that had no exposure, and the blue is the group who knew of somebody. And the thing that Dr. Coleman had which was really interesting, was to look at an analysis depending on whether the person knew the person or not. Because the hypothesis was, well, if it was your best friend who died by suicide, maybe that would really increase your risk of attempting suicide. Whereas if it was someone peripheral who you just heard about, maybe it wouldn't. And what he found is it didn't make any difference. Merely having knowledge of a peer who had died by suicide increased the risk of suicide attempts from anywhere from 1 to 3% all the way up to about 7 or 8%. And again, it's just a mind-boggling number. Next slide, please. So what's the key thing here? The active ingredient in suicide is something called constriction. We all have a menu of options, right? Everyone here decided to wake up today and come to this webinar. Tonight you'll decide what to have for dinner. We all decide things about what we're going to do in our lives all the time. But people who feel suicidal in that key moment when they're contemplating whether to end their lives or not feel stuck. They feel that there are absolutely no other options and they're constricted. And so the key focus, therefore, of prevention efforts actually really should not be on talking about suicide death. We can do it, we have to do it, not suggesting censorship. It's important to talk about these things. But the main focus should not be on hammering home all the people who die, giving people an erroneous sense that they are doomed and destined to die by suicide, but instead to share those cases, if you have to, as tragic outliers and spend most of your time talking about the fact that there are lots of ways that people can survive. Right, just like when you go to school, if you're trying to learn about a heart attack and how to prevent a heart attack, they don't give you hour after hour showing you blockage of the coronary arteries. They tell you about how to exercise and have a healthy diet. They teach you how to not have a heart attack, not how to have a heart attack. Next slide, please. So this brings to the corollary effect of the Werther effect called the Papageno effect. And the Papageno effect is essentially resilience contagion. If you go one more slide, my colleague in Vienna, Austria, did a study of suicide-related articles that came out in the Austrian media, and he found that about 10% of them had this narrative arc where someone was suicidal, but they found some way to manage, and now they're doing much better. You can't see it, but in this picture, you probably can't see it. At the bottom of this slide, there's a guy named Martin, and he has a phone in his hand, and he's calling a crisis line. And so this is about how Martin was not feeling good, but he reached out and now he's doing a lot better. And after articles with that narrative came out in Austria, there was a small but statistically significant reduction in the percentage of people who died by suicide, or the rate of people who died by suicide. Next slide, please. You have to do 2 clicks. Yeah, small decrease. Next. Yeah. And then in 2019, last year, Thomas put out a study where he actually looked at this experimentally, and he took a whole bunch of people who had suicidal thoughts, and he had some of them, half of them, read stories of survival, and he had the other half read stories, some sort of neutral story. It wasn't about death, but it just wasn't about survival. And the group who read the story about survival actually had a substantially diminished amount of suicidal thoughts. So disseminating those kinds of stories are really key. Next slide, please. I'm worried I'm going, yeah, just go, maybe click through about 7 times here. Yeah, so I think I'm running out of time, but I guess my conclusion here is that what you really need to do is to try to find a way to have the message pervading campus one of resilience. We expect people to survive, we expect people to manage, we expect people to run into trouble, because people do run into trouble. All of us actually have distress in our lives. Some people it gets to the point of having a mental disorder, but even if you don't have that, it can get really intense at times, and we all need an action plan. And so probably if I was to pick one thing that would be really helpful to do, it's really to try to go through a stepwise action plan like this one, which the slides will be given to you. And in fact, the next slide is the coping card from Sunnybrook, which you can find online if you just Google Sunnybrook coping card. We have it in like 20 languages. And you essentially can go through this sequence of steps of things that one can do, which if there's time later, maybe I can walk you through. But essentially to realize that when you feel like you're constricted and there's nothing you can do, the only thing you can do to die is to die. Well, what I tell my patients is actually there's like 7 or 8 different categories of things that you can do. And within those, there are subcategories. And I want you to march through each of them. And if things fail, then you kind of get to the next one and the next one. And if things just really can't work out, that's where you call a crisis line or go to the emergency department. And then just maybe the last thing I'll just say, if you go 2 slides ahead, the next one is just a picture of the coping card, which again, you guys can find online. And then just the last one is just to say that, again, rather than focusing on doom and gloom and how everybody's going to die, which again, just to separate things out a little bit, in my office, that's what I do. If someone comes into my office and they're suicidal, we have to spend a lot of time talking about that in very great detail. But that's not exactly the same thing as what we want to do across a whole campus, where many people maybe in that moment aren't thinking about suicide. And what you really want to focus on is to message that they're going to be in distress. Here's how, because everyone gets in distress. Here are some basic ways of managing distress, and here's where you turn when it doesn't work. And then this last slide is really just to focus on the idea that there are many things that can protect. And if there are things on this list that you can bolster in your students or in your campus, thinking about what are your goals, what's hope for the future, what are the stress busters that people can try, that's really, I think, what we want to try to emphasize. And my time is up, so I thank you.
Thank you, Mark. This has been really helpful. And thank you for sharing these wonderful resources and a narrative of hope and resilience. Now, interestingly, I learned about your work through Ed's team, that Ed Mantler's team, who I'm going to introduce in a second here, through the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And it was work on creating kind of like safe language and looking at talking about dialogue safely. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Ed Mantler, who's the Vice President of Programs and Priorities from the Mental Health Commission of Canada. So I'll take it away, Ed.
Great, thank you so much, and pleasure to be here. Nice to virtually see everyone. The Mental Health Commission of Canada, of course, works on a broad mental health and wellness mandate, and part of that is a focus on suicide prevention, because simply the numbers of people who die by suicide in our country are unacceptable. Much of that work takes focus through a project called Roots of Hope, which is a community development model for suicide prevention that's currently being demonstrated in 8 communities across the province. But what I'd like to focus on today is a bit more about the safe messaging that Lena had just spoken about, and it really builds on some of the points that Mark made earlier. If we could move to the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of kind of post-secondary students in Canada, extrapolating from a college health survey that's done by Americans, but actually has Canadian respondents, and this is reporting on the Canadian respondents. The fact that students feel stressed to some degree is perfectly normal. The fact that students sometimes feel anxiety, sometimes feel fear, perhaps sometimes feel sadness or loneliness as a result of their being in school maybe for the first time, these are perfectly normal emotions, and there's nothing wrong with them. So where the problem comes is that as Canadians, many of us do not have the skills and knowledge to recognize those normal emotions and know how to cope with them, the resilience that Mark was talking about. And so, so without resilience, those perfectly normal feelings, emotions, fears, anxieties can grow and perpetuate and result in a number of physical illnesses, mental health problems and illnesses, up to and including thinking about suicide or even attempting suicide behavior. As you can see on the stats here, I think the numbers are fairly staggering, that 8.7% of students report that they self-injured, many of them seriously, and that a significant number, I think, have even attempted suicide. As we move on to the next slide, targeting suicide prevention in and of itself is simply too short-sighted. We need to take a broader approach that looks at the community, the context, in the case of students, the campus environment, and so on, that contributes to anxiety, contributes to ways of coping, contributes to feeling supported and involved and engaged in the world around them. And some of that really is around addressing messaging. Mark had referred to some studies done by Dr. Rob Whitley, and we've worked with Dr. Whitley quite closely on studying the impact of a media guide called Mindset. And it's a guide that was developed with journalists along with the Mental Health Commission of Canada in order to provide journalists across the country in all formats with guidance, guidelines, some evidence-based structure on how to report on mental health problems and illnesses. And Dr. Whitley's research shows that it's been quite effective, but not in the area of suicide prevention. So the guide is actually being revised right now. Again, the Mental Health Commission of Canada working with journalists in order to give better guidance on that safe messaging, how to report on suicidal related stories within the media. So that's hopefully a positive impact coming from that. It's interesting, you know, most people who die by suicide actually see their family physician or their primary care provider in the few weeks and months before that activity. And unfortunately, most are not asked about their mental health or their thoughts of suicide. And when we talk to family physicians, that's often because they don't know how to ask the question. They've never learned how to ask that question in a safe, comfortable way, and they don't necessarily have confidence in their skills to be able to deal with the answer when they ask that question. So again, working very, very closely with the physician community, and there's training available for doctors and nurses around those safe conversations specifically related to suicide. With the 2 million students who are on campuses, or as of today, are off campuses, but virtually connected to campuses, this is, mental health within the post-secondary system and environment is a big deal. We talked about, Mark had talked earlier about resiliency, and I had mentioned, you know, that normal continuum of emotions that we all have, and the difficulty sometimes in recognizing when those emotions or thoughts are becoming problematic and knowing what to do with them. The Inquiring Mind is an evidence-based teaching program to help people learn how to do just that. It was actually developed originally by the Navy SEALs in the US, and then later used by our own military and then police and first responders here in Canada. Very effectively evaluated, and so it's now been adapted for use in the post-secondary environment. What it does is gives people basically lists of the kind of thoughts or behaviors or ideas that one might be having, categorizes them in very non-medical terminology, everyday language, in a color scheme from green to red, what's healthy, what's becoming a problem or an illness, and everything that can happen in between. And it teaches people how to recognize when they're going from healthy green towards the red, and then what to do about it. And the strategies are simple, effective, cognitive behavioral self-help techniques that work very, very well. So that program available and is making some big differences. Mental health first aid, many of you are probably familiar with mental health first aid. It's really about helping those around you, recognizing when people that you're associating with maybe having mental health problems, difficulties, illnesses, and knowing how to respond, especially if it's a crisis, not becoming a therapist, but just knowing how to handle the situation and kind of stabilize until can be put in place or the problem passes. So the inquiring mind about helping myself, mental health first aid, giving me the skills to help other people around me. The environment that all of this takes place in is so important. The environment is provided by the university or the college or the CEGEP, as well as the environment that's created by the students, student leadership within the school. And all of that kind of comes together in a new document called the Post-Secondary Student Standard. It's being developed by the Canadian Standards Association. Working with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, it's been through an extremely thorough process to curate just the best evidence and create standards, learning from the very successful National Standard on Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. And so this translates many of the findings and learnings from that standard into one that's specific to students. The development of the standard has just wrapped up. It's going out for public release very, very soon here. So watch for that standard. It can really help a whole of campus approach to a more mentally healthy and safe environment for faculty and students and staff. And on the next page, the next slide, just give you an indication of the supporters of developing that standard. Universities Canada and Colleges and Institutes Canada have been on board, as well as the RBC Foundation and Bell Let's Talk, a major contributor there. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Eric Windler here. I hope you can hear me okay. Tyab, give me a wave if I'm at the right volume. Pleasure to be here, and thank you all, and Mark and Ed for leading into it. And Ed, I got to say right off the bat, we're super excited about the release of the post-secondary standard, which is coming up, and I guess that's coming up soon. We'll probably get into that a little bit more. But I wanted to start a little bit with my story. I don't come at this with the same background as Mark or Tyab, for example. I've been a businessman, an entrepreneur all my life. And back exactly 10 years and 3 months ago, we thought we had the sort of happiest, healthiest, most fortunate family going. Sandra was an executive at BMO, my wife, and I was busy with a tech startup, and our welcome to this whole world of suicide prevention and mental health started with a call from a police officer. And that unfortunate police officer had to come to our house, and in about 30 seconds had to let us know that we had lost our son, Jack. He passed away in his residence room at Queen's University. He had been a perfectly well-qualified student heading off to the university of his choice. And we found out later, after we kind of picked ourselves up off the ground, that although he was very well academically prepared, it turns out he started to struggle almost as soon as he got to Queen's. And so this would have been the fall of 2009. I found out later by visiting the school and talking to a lot of the students and residence dons that knew Jack there, that unbeknownst to us, because he wasn't able to tell us what was going on, he had sort of withdrawn from classes as early October, and he didn't pass away until March. So, I can talk somewhat unemotionally about that now, but I think it's important for people to understand that represents a very interesting period of time between when struggle could have been recognized by those around him, could have been recognized if we as a family knew how to ask the right kind of questions and have these kind of conversations. But we were just a happy-go-lucky family that thought everything was going well. And we did check in with Jack, but he was unable to tell us about it. A lot has changed in those 10 years at schools like Queen's and many others. Things like mental health first aid training, things like residence dawn training, teacher assistants and so on are getting education to understand what the signs and symptoms are. But just to carry on our story a little bit, it was only a couple months later that Sandra and I decided to make a memorial gift in Jack's honor to Kids Help Phone. And it turns out, never went back to my day job, and I've been working at this ever since. We had no idea it would turn into what Jack.org has become, but we did. I started volunteering at Kids Help Phone. We turned around 3 times, and there was about 600,000 that we had raised. So we had an opportunity to run a pilot program based at Kids Help Phone, which involved talking to students, educators, and parents from 36 schools, high schools and post-secondaries, because immediately we were very interested in this transition from high school to whatever comes next, because that's a particularly risky time for young people. And at the time, I'd already met with people like Senator Michael Kirby, who was at the time the chair of the Mental Health Commission. Different experts in the field had already kind of pointed us in this direction. But we quickly learned through that year of pilots with that 36 schools that there was a big opportunity that was being missed, a gap, if you like, in terms of truly engaging young people in this most important health conversation that's affecting them all. And so we then, after 2 years, we actually transferred our fund, and by that time we had raised well over $1 million. We transferred the balance of the fund, left some of it behind to help Kids Help Phone with some of their programs, like we helped them get their chat service started, their resources around me started. But we moved the bulk of the funds to Queen's University, where we continued our pilot. And that's where we really started doubling down and working with students. That was the first year. It was in March of 2013. We had our first national student summit called Jack Summit. And we brought students from every province and territory together to talk about mental health, to connect with one another. And, lo and behold, even in 2013, we found out there was literally thousands of students who cared about this and wanted to get involved. So that's been kind of the angle of Jack.org. And if you fast forward to today, there's 46 staff. We have 10 more hires in our plan for this coming year. And there's over 3,000 young people who actively volunteer with Jack.org. And I'll get into those details in a moment, but there's a very brief video that hopefully will energize us all. And if you could play that video now, then I'll come back on.
Why do we do what we do? Because suicide is the #1 health-related cause of death for young people in Canada. We're struggling with our mental health, and we're not getting the support we need and deserve. Things need to change, and we will lead it. Jack.org is the only Canadian charity training and empowering young leaders to revolutionize mental health. What does our revolution look like? It looks like a Canada where all young people understand how to take care of their own mental health and look out for each other. A Canada where all those that need support get the help they deserve. We make it all happen through Jack Talks, Jack Chapters, and Jack Summits. Jack Talks send trained young speakers to talk to their peers and teach them about the basics of mental health, signs of struggle, how to find help, and ultimately how to take care of their own mental health and look out for each other. Jack chapters are groups of young leaders that work year-round to identify and dismantle barriers to positive mental health in their communities. Jack chapters create local initiatives rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. That's why no two Jack chapters are exactly the same. Jack summits help build the leadership and advocacy skills of young people across Canada. Each Jack summit brings young leaders together to learn from each other and develop strategies to amplify our collective impact. With a network of thousands of young leaders in every province and territory, over 10,000 individual donors, partners, and collaborators fueling our work, we're just getting started. Join the movement.
All right. So, can you see my screen, Eric?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I can see it now. It didn't really play, but you're going to try it again?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, we're gonna start the video now.
The #1 health-related cause of death for young people in Canada. We're struggling with our mental health and we're not getting the support we need and deserve. Things need to change, and we will lead it. Jack.org is the only Canadian charity training and empowering young leaders to revolutionize mental health. What does our revolution look like? It looks like a Canada where all young people understand how to take care of their own mental health and look out for each other. A Canada where all those that need support get the help they deserve. We make it all happen through Jack Talks, Jack Chapters, and Jack Summits. Jack Talks send trained young speakers to talk to their peers and teach them about the basics of mental health, signs of struggle, how to find help, and ultimately how to take care of their own mental health and look out for each other. Jack Chapters are groups of young leaders that work year-round to identify and dismantle barriers to positive mental health in their communities. Jack Chapters create local initiatives rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. That's why no two Jack Chapters are exactly the same. Jack Summits help build the leadership and advocacy skills of young people across Canada. Each Jack Summit brings young leaders together to learn from each other and develop strategies to amplify our collective impact. With a network of thousands of young leaders in every province and territory, over 10,000 individual donors, partners, and collaborators fueling our work, we're just getting started. Join the movement.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. If you throw up the slides there again, Tayab.
Yes.
Sorry you had to go through the audio twice.
I was playing on my computer. My apologies. You have to just meditate on the slide. So sorry.
Okay, if you click one, actually two more times, I think you'll bring up some text. So I just touched briefly on this. The video does a good job of quickly explaining what we do, and this gives you some of the numbers. The core programs are the talks, chapters, and summits. And as you can see, this current school year, which is the bottom line on the slide, we have over 160 trained Jack Talk speakers. These are young people who want to be involved and actually go through about 50 to 60 hours of public speaking training, contextualized to how to safely share their story and educate their peers on mental health. And it is known that this peer-to-peer education is the most effective way really to do anything in terms of education, but certainly when it comes to mental health, it just sort of normalizes things for young people. We were on schedule when COVID hit to give 550 talks this current school year, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The next, as you'll see, this past year, the target was to go from 220 chapters to 285 Jack chapters. So then again, these are student-led groups, clubs, if you like, on campuses, both high school and post-secondary. About almost 70 of them are on post-secondary campuses, the balance are on high school. So we actually have a much higher penetration on the post-secondary side with lots of room to grow on the high school side in particular. We're at about 250 chapters at the moment when COVID hit. So, and that's a whole nother story about how we're keeping those chapters engaged during these COVID times, mainly by them doing online initiatives versus their in-person initiatives. And then we have what we call Jack Summits. So you saw some video of our national Jack Summit. That event actually had to be held virtually like this year. There was 300 participants from all over Canada and about 10 international delegates, a bunch of international and national speakers on this type of format. It happened over 7 days, and it was a tremendous substitute for an in-person conference that normally happens. We also have large regional events called Regional Jack Summits. So we have one in Yellowknife bringing students from all 3 territories, one in BC, one in Winnipeg, bring all the prairies provinces together. We have a Francophone one in Montreal, and we have one in Atlantic Canada based in Halifax. And then we have local summits, which are smaller meetups of students, and this will be locally hosted by one school, and then the student leaders from the other schools come in. So the summits are really all about what we call our young leaders, to prepare them to reach the mass population. So obviously with 46 staff, we can do quite a bit, but the leverage that's provided by having 3,000 trained young people doing this work across the country and supporting their work gives us a huge leverage to reach more young people. So I just briefly wanted to touch on what's happened since COVID. We have flexed all of our programs to digital. Having a young team really helps in this area, but we immediately recorded a virtual Jack Talk, which is available and being used up until a couple of weeks ago by teachers across the country to educate their students remotely. It's also available, freely available on our website for at-home viewing by young people or those who support them. I mentioned the Jack Summit and how we're supporting our chapters with virtual support and meetups, different ways that they can engage their audiences during these times. So if you carry on to the next slide, I did want to mention that we have a resource that has really become a big part of our work. And it dates back to about 3 years ago when all of these young leaders started coming to us and saying, wow, this conversation is becoming so normalized. A lot of young people are coming up to us at our chapter events or at our talks, and we want to know how to best be there for them. And Be There is an evidence-based resource that we spent about 18 months developing. And before we even did that, we did a global landscape scan, and we were looking for 2 things. We were looking for something that would really not try to turn young people into mental health professionals. You got to go to med school to get that, or become a psychologist or whatever, but really give them the basic skills that the entire population of young people and those who support them can learn to understand how to weigh into these difficult conversations. So we launched the resource a year ago in May. It was kind of our pilot year, and there was we had a target of 180,000 unique visitors and users of the site. We blew through that target and are close to 300,000 users. And at the very end of the year, there's some really fun news that came along because Be There became nominated and eventually was recognized as the best global health website through an organization called the Webbies. So this is like the Academy Awards, but it's for websites, and they recognize websites of all different types. And Be There was nominated for the best health website and ended up actually winning 2 Webbies. The panel selected and the People's Choice Award, they called it. But I really want to make sure people understand that resource is there. It's free and it's available. It's in English and it's in French. We've now partnered with an organization in the States that was founded by Lady Gaga. You may have heard of her. She happens to be fairly prominent. I say that tongue in cheek. She and her mother actually founded Born This Way Foundation, which is based out of the US. It does a little bit similar work to what we do. And they were looking for a resource that could help with their schools train students during COVID times. And they're helping us get the word out there. And we're looking at some additional work with them going forward. So Be There is really our toe into this whole digital work. And we're really anticipating that, we're seeing, Tayab and I discussed it before we came on to the seminar, COVID times are really accelerating the pace of digital therapy and things like that. And Be There is an example of that is something that's free and available. It's engaging, it's full of young people sharing their stories in a safe and meaningful way, and great examples. It's based around something called 5 golden rules for how to support somebody. And in that sense, it's been picked up by a number of post-secondary campuses to train residence dons and TAs, et cetera. So we're super excited about the digital resources that we will currently we are creating, and then they will be a nice complement to our in-person work if and when normal returns. So thanks again for having me, and back over to you, I guess, Lena.
Okay. Go ahead, Tayyab, you're on next.
Thank you so much, Eric, Ed, and Mark. I could not have, despite the technological challenges, which for me compare pale in comparison to the wonderful work you have done, not only today, but for years and decades. So thank you so much to bring that work in this succinct way. Let me start the question answer process with the two observations. The first one is Mark and I had the pleasure of working supervising one of our senior year students' thesis, where we found that in addition to when you control for this, so I will try to explain, Mark, in a very simple language. Controlling for symptomatic stress, we found that the absence of certain strengths also reliably predicted suicidal behavior. So that goes back to the point Mark was saying, that we also need to underscore the need for resilience, for positive mental health. And you might have heard from the dual mental health continuum, which says that absence of symptom is not the presence of mental health. Okay? So for mental health, we need to do something on the positive side of mental health. So that, I think the point was very well brought. Thank you, Mark. And I so much admire the work the Commission is doing, and we are looking forward. Not only we, the whole post-secondary campus is looking toward the standards and the numerous guides and kits, especially from Mental Health Commission, the Suicide Kit, and also the virtual therapy, virtual e-mental health kit is very useful. And I cannot say anything about Eric because I'm familiar. I have the pleasure to know Eric, but also be a little bit of just a rider in that journey, virtually and metaphorically. This is what you have brought to our discussion. This is the manifestation of how a caring and compassionate community and campus partnership needs to be done. We cannot do this. Look, our resources on campuses are finite, and there's always race for resources, and I have always said that there will never be enough therapists. So we need to look from a much larger perspective. So thank you so much for bringing your insights, which I'm sure our panelists, our audience have benefited. And Lena, over to you to moderate the questions. Any insights, any thoughts you may have?
Thank you, Tayyab. I'm very impressed by the amount of work that's being done in life promotion and supporting resilience. And I had the pleasure of working with the McGill rep of the jack.org at my institution. And I was just so inspired by her passion, her work, and how she was also able to share safe ways to have conversations around suicide prevention and around mental health. And it's really been helping our community to move forward with our work in suicide prevention efforts. So I would like to turn over the discussion questions, but for our panelists, but I did have one question for Ed, which was in the chat. When will the standard be available?
Thanks for that question, Lena. I don't have a specific date that is kind of in the works leading up to that date, but it will be over the summer to early fall. Okay. So it will be very soon. and when it's available, there will be press releases, there will be communication to all colleges, universities, and institutes. So the word should get out quickly.
Wonderful, thank you. And we'll be definitely, we'll be circulating it on our resources as well. Okay, so we have a number of questions for our panelists today. And Tayab, I think because we have about 25 minutes, I think what we're going to do is we are going to invite the panelists to select one question that they would like to talk about. We really would like to have a conversation about compassionate circles of care. So I will invite the panelists to provide their feedback on any one of these 4 questions.
Sure, it's Ed here, and maybe I'll start with addressing the first question. You know, it's important that we don't consider any activity in this area as a silver bullet, that if we do this one thing, we're going to solve the problem or have a major impact. So really having a comprehensive plan or look at what experiences students are having, what things they're experiencing are really important. And that's where the national standard will be important, because it gives that broad, comprehensive guidance to institutions in doing that kind of planning together with their student leaders. There's so many barriers that students can face to getting help once they recognize that they need help. There are many barriers to even recognizing they need help, but so many barriers to getting help once they need it. There can be long wait lists for on-campus services. It can be stigmatizing just to even approach those services. So having a variety of mechanisms for accessing help within the plan is really important. Peer support, supporting peer support counseling, peer support networks and groups, having a way to refer students to professional help, either on or off campus when needed, and providing students with resources, materials, training for self-management and resilience are part of that package as well. So, you know, having a broader look at the campus and identifying those student populations that might be more at risk or more vulnerable, international students, LGBTQ2+ students, physically handicapped students. There are groups that are known to be higher risk, so deserve special attention. And remembering that students need to remain connected to their families as well for that support, their post-secondary social support and familial support systems, enabling ways in order to maintain those connections is important. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, Eric. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
I'd like to comment on question 1 a little bit too, and I think I totally agree with everything that Ed is saying. But I want to almost take it back to common sense, and this needs to start long before the students even arrive on campus. Okay, just think how smart that would be, right? So it needs to be part of the application process. It needs to be part of those advanced tours. You know, I remember literally the advanced tour I took to Queens, and I'm not pointing fingers at all here because I'm sure most schools at that time were like this. And it was more of a sell job of why you should come here. It wasn't about, you know, here's what you can expect. But those advanced tours would take you and normalize, you know, this is not only where the health center is, this is where the mental health and wellness support is provided. But then when they arrive, this is where the action really starts. And we've been involved with lots of this. But so, you know, getting in front of those those freshmen, and getting in front of all of them with upper year students in particular, who are prepared to sort of educate them about all sorts of things, but equally important to any of them, perhaps more important to any of them, is that this is what you're going to expect. You're going to run into some challenges. And here's not only how you can support yourself, but here's how we can count on you to support other people. Because let's face it, what's the most honorable thing to do? help one of your friends, help your roommate, help a peer. That is something that you can appeal to in young people. And in order to do that, you have to give them some education about how to do that help, and that harkens back to the content we have in our Be There resource. And all that gets down to breaking down the barriers to lack of education, the stigma, and a lot of that's disappearing, but a lot more work needs to continue to be done because it's a new wave coming through, and it's, as Ed mentioned, it's international students coming from different cultures, it's BIPOC students, it's all kinds of young people arriving to this melting pot. And I often use the example that I can only imagine Jack was going through. He walk out on that beautiful campus at University in Union, and it looks like every student is on fire. It looks like they're just, killing it. They're just doing great, and you feel terrible. You need to make young people understand that that could be normal in your journey, and here's how you can get out of that. And then it gets into all these best practices in terms of having these contextualized services. And I'll give Mark a chance to weigh in here. A lot of them will be guided by the post-secondary standard. We do something which is a youth-led campus assessment tool that we're now in our finishing our second year of, which is not only but handing it over to students to work with administrations to get a student lens on what's there and what they know about and what they think of those resources. Because it'd be great to have a service, but if students don't want to go to it because A, they don't know where it is, or they don't think it's a appropriate resource, it's not doing much good, is it? So it's a very complicated thing, but I think if you march through that in a logical, common sense approach, you'll come up with the right answers of how to have a resilient, helpful environment for young people. And I think it'll get to the point where post-secondary institutions are measured not just, we know about the Maclean's rankings. I envision there will be a very strong ranking of post-secondary institutions. They're taking our most precious asset and they're having them on that campus for 4 years. And sure, we want them to get well educated, but not at the price of their mental health. And that all underpins the suicide prevention piece we're talking about today. Over to you.
Thank you. This has been really, really helpful. I also, at the foundation of what both Ed and Eric talked about was communications. And which kind of leads us to our second question. One of the things that I've been hearing a lot on our campus is we want to know, language matters, which in fact is a resource that is available through the Mental Health Commission of Canada that we found very, very helpful. But also, how do we communicate safely? How do we communicate in ways that really support students? So do you all have any insights for our participants on how we can support students, both in person and online? Because there's a lot of anxiety about how to help students communicate safely, especially via social media.
Can I maybe I'll just jump in, and I don't know if my answer fully, I think I want to cover in a way a bit of all four at once.
Great.
Just to say that I think both Eric and Ed really took the words out of my mouth, so I'll try to augment them in some way, because I couldn't agree more. There's sometimes, I think, a philosophical mistake of trying to pick out the needle in the haystack of the person who's going to die by suicide, which actually we have no history of being able to do. And at a university level on any year, people don't keep good stats, but it's probably something like 1 out of every 20,000 university students per year who die by suicide, which is half actually the national average, but still, again, I mean, that's still way too many. But what it means is it's going to be very, very difficult to detect that specific individual. However, a much larger group of those people will be at risk of suicide throughout their lives. I mean, the highest risk period is between the age of 40 and 60. And so a lot of the work you're doing in university is actually trying to prevent suicide 20 years later. And then also, of course, even those people who will never die by suicide may still be struggling very, terribly with addictions and other mental health problems that can have incredible negative effects across their whole life, including death by other causes, because we know that people with mood disorders die frequently from cardiovascular illness. So the key thing from my standpoint, just to augment, I guess, what was already said, is to say, look, as Eric said, you have to start early. I would start at, before, or at certainly on campus on Frosh Week, essentially saying, look, if these are the 20,000 at-risk students, 100% of them are going to have some kind of distress. I don't know anybody who went through university where there wasn't anything that bothered them. And then there are going to be these pockets. There's going to be 1,000 who have, or a few thousand with addictions issues. And then there's going to be a few thousand out of that 20,000 who are going to have mood problems and so on. And so there's this iceberg of youth who have various levels of mental health challenges, going from the very superficial to the very deep. And again, very tragically, in rare circumstances, they might actually die by suicide. And so the whole thing is to just start by saying, okay, as Eric said, common sense. How do you manage distress? We're expecting it to happen. What are the things that you can access? What happens when they go wrong? This gets a bit to question number 4, which is this, the question of how you can leverage something. I mean, the Be There initiative sounds incredible. Maybe that's something to share with students at Frosh Week. There's another, by the way, mistake that often gets made in these kinds of scenarios, where what happens is you dump a lot of resources on people who aren't necessarily fully ready for it or may not internalize it. So you're going to get a certain group at the beginning. But then they might really need to hear about it before the drop date for classes, or they might need to hear it again before the exam period. So the idea would be some kind of upfront resources and information, which then gets reiterated at key points throughout the year across the population. And I think that gets a little bit to question number 2 about how to communicate in an effective way. And then I think the other thing is again, just to be honest, right? We don't want to present this picture of every university student who's happy-go-lucky and rollerblading in August, and they're doing, great, and they're sailing through their courses, because that's really a fantasy. And even those people who are successful still have struggles and difficulties. And so the key thing is just to sort of hammer that home as an expected issue in the communication, and to offer as much support and hope, including to access, resources in 3 places. I mean, one of them is on campus with peers. One of them maybe through something like Be There, or through other peripheral or affiliated mental health organizations. And the third one is in your family. And one of those things is going to work.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Would anyone like to add to Mark's commentary?
I would just, again, I think we're kind of at throwing in answers to all the questions at once. I hope that's okay.
That's great.
Very helpful, Mark. And I love the way you actually described the sort of iceberg scenario, right? Because you're so right. I remember, when I was at university, and I happen to go to Queen's as well, I don't recall anybody being suicidal, but did I see some excess drinking? Did I see some flunking out, which would cause, distress and all the rest of it? It's just a really interesting way, I think, that you positioned that. But that education, or sorry, that communication, to point number 2, has to be consistent and appropriate. You really need to put the same level of communications expertise. And that's what we've really tried to do with Jack.org. And I'm incredibly proud of the team and how they handle communication, everything from our website to the Be There resource to how the social media gets presented. It has to be very inclusive and not leave out certain populations. And it's got to speak authentically, and that's where the peer-to-peer thing comes out. If you see student athletes in those communications, it will resonate with student athletes. If you see those kind of nerdy academics in there, it will resonate with a certain population. If you see artists and dancers, you see BIPOC students represented, it normalizes all that sort of communication. And it can't be a flood in Frosh Week and then forgotten about. It has to be something that is a strategic communications plan that happens throughout the year, and it's authentic, and that's one of the reasons we named that resource Be There, because maybe you're not going to need it at the moment you've heard of it, but hopefully you remember when you see your friend struggling. And I can't tell you how many young people have come up to us and said, yeah, I knew about it, and I remembered, oh yeah, that thing called Be There, because I want to be there for my friend. So it's, I'm not meaning to push Be There, but you have to think strategically about communications in a way that young people want to receive them. And then you have to also do the education of that sort of circle of care around them, and make sure that those people, from the residents, dons, the TAs, the faculty, the staff, have the education on all this. And many schools are doing a much better job on that, but so much more can be done to sort of catch those students that are going off the track And they're not suicidal yet, but catch them at the point where they're struggling and get them back on track. Because we know if you reach those students at that early stage, the outcomes are incredibly good. So I just think, we're not going to give a specific plan of how to do it. I also wanted to throw out, and I hate to keep on bringing up Queens, but I'm very close to them, obviously, but they have a program called Bounce Back. And this is, there's also a CMHA funded program called Bounce Back, but this one is actually identifies students who are struggling with their grades at the very first midterm. And then it reaches out to them and offers to pair up an upper year student who volunteers to spend time with them and help them get organized, help them, because all these students are qualified, or else they wouldn't be at the school. They're smart enough to do the work. That's not the issue. There's something else going on. And a bounce back is a great way that's mainly contextualized around academic performance, but it allows them to address those issues and point that student in the right direction if they need some other sort of support. I'm convinced a program like that would have saved my son, right? If somebody had an upper year student who you respected, had spent a bit of time with them in a caring way, I think that could have been a game changer. So there's programs like that schools can learn one from another and get in place on their campuses.
Great, thank you. Now that resource is Bounce Back from Queens, right? Great, thank you. So we're going to open up the floor.
Not a resource, it's a program.
It's a program. Okay.
Lena, I also want to thank you so much for these comprehensive answers. I also want to get some views from all three of you of this paradox that as a clinician, as a clinical researcher, I face, and Mark, perhaps you also face. Universities, post-secondary institutions at times have made this argument: they are not psychiatric facilities. They are academia, so they are academies. They are for academics. Even though when I have at times given the statistics that if you bring me 10 students with all things equal cognitive ability, only based on cognitive abilities alone, only 6 will graduate, 4 will not graduate. So there's a huge chunk who will not graduate because those are non-academic factors. So how, Eric and Ed and Mark, or if you could share, especially as we are seeing more and more vulnerable students, culturally diverse students, and they may need more support. So rather than question is, do the post-secondary institutions should provide all support, especially to the most vulnerable students on campus, or they should just refer them out?
That's a great question, and it's very situational. I don't know that I can provide you with one single answer to that, but it's a question that I think every post-secondary organization needs to ask, based on its environment, location, student body, etc., what the best approach is. Your opening comment to that, though, I thought was a very interesting one, because it's one I hear very often, that post-secondary institutions are not psychiatric service providers. And that's certainly the case. That's true. And it's a bit of an excuse for not taking a look at psychological health and safety in the post-secondary environment. They are, in fact, large institutions that create their own culture within and have some control over the kind of culture that's created there. And that culture and the kind of activities that the culture facilitates or supports, I think is the fundamental question, far more important than whether the psychologist is on campus or off.
Okay, maybe I'll just jump in. I guess I agree with Ed that it's a bit of a cop-out. The way that I sort of, I don't know how other people feel, but I always think that university is sort of the last opportunity to be in school and to learn how to be and how to manage like an adult before you actually have to be in the real world. And so if the mandate is to educate our youth about how to exist in the universe, then part of that actually has to be how to manage their own adult feelings and, you know, manage relationships and how they are with peers. And so it seems to me that a very large proportion of it, thinking about that iceberg, should really be able to be taken care of in the context of just sort of a healthy workplace, the first workplace before the real workplace. And then, yeah, I mean, you're not going to install an electroconvulsive therapy suite in the health and wellness center. So there, you know, but the number of, you know, young people of that age who need that kind of treatment is going to be a vanishingly small percentage of the population. So to me, the thought is, you know, you provide some health and well-being for the majority, and then when it exceeds whatever your mandate or your capacity is, that's when you refer on, and hopefully then the health system can accommodate those youth.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I'd like to echo both those comments. I think that's right on the money. You know, it is a bit of a cop-out, but it's also an evolution. You know, I remember when I was at Queen's and entering first year commerce, if you can imagine, a long time ago, the dean of business stood on the stage and looked at the 200 of us or 250 of us and says, look to your left, look to your right. One of you won't be here next year. Make sure it's not you. I mean, that was culturally acceptable at the time. And I remember how much I struggled. I came from Nova Scotia. I didn't have grade 13 at the time, so I hadn't taken calculus. And that first year was a bit of a load combined with all the other stuff. Now I got through it and you know, and carried on. But if it's a cop-out in the sense that, you know, workplaces are entirely changing. They're caring about the mental health of, you know, professional sports team give mental health support to their top professional athletes to make sure they can perform at a top level. Why wouldn't we want to take care of our young people the same? It's complete common sense. And I think investment in the prevention promotion is huge. And what I would call on campus mild to moderate type stuff should be invested in on campus. You know, and Mark, you've made a sort of an extreme example, but you know, we could use the COVID example. They're not going to have the ventilators on campus, but they're going to take care of patients till they need to go to the equivalent of intensive care. And I believe, like I alluded to earlier, that the schools are going to get smart about this, and they're going to start to realize there's a payback to doing this. And it's just the right thing to do. And as society, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, starts to invest properly in mental health, we will see the return on investment for our most precious asset, those young people. And this is you know, I think it's roughly half of young people in Canada go on to post-secondary, if not a bit more. I'm not sure I have that stat right off the top of my head, but that's what I recall. You know, they're the ones that are going to be likely the leaders, whether they go into education, they go into healthcare, they go into business, whatever they do. Let's make sure we give them the best start. And that requires partnering with those organizations in your community, whether it's the local hospital or other community agencies. And another big thing, Tayab, that I think, I don't know if we'll have time to touch on, but how do we make these services equitable? So yeah, you know, my dad works at a bank and I have lots of benefits coverage, and some student coming from out of country doesn't have that kind of coverage. That's not okay. We have to make it acceptable or equitable for all students in a way that they will take up those resources and benefit from them.
Thank you so much, Eric. Lena, I don't know if we have time for a Q&A.
I think we ran out of time. We have 1 minute left, but what we'll do is we will collate the questions and see if we can provide responses to our community. I want to thank everyone, thank the panelists for joining us today. We really, really appreciate your perspectives and all of the knowledge that you've shared with us. And please do take care. If you feel that you need to reach out, we know that this has been, this information can be triggering at times, please do so. We will follow up with the resources. And I believe, Tayab, it's almost the second to last slide. Thank you, everyone. And please feel free to connect with us if you have any other questions.
Thank you so much. I cannot thank enough to Mark, Eric, and Ed. You took time from your busy schedules and you did your part for the post-secondary, for the young people of this country and hopefully beyond. And this is what exactly our title was, our attempt was in creating a more caring and compassionate community. And there couldn't be a better illustration of that in terms of your contribution. Lena and I are very, very thankful to you. And thank you so much. And I also want to thank our support staff from Caucus, Khadija. Is there any last minute things, Khadija, we need to do before
I just wanted to say thank you to our presenters, Lena, Tayab, Eric, Mark, and Ed. And also thanks to all of you for joining us for Caucus Online today. We'd really appreciate your feedback, so make sure to fill out the short webinar evaluation in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are tweeting, tagging, or sharing anything on social media, be sure to use the hashtag #CaucusOnline. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.